A sixth grade teacher was trying her best to discipline a particularly mischievous student. She tried to reason with him, she tried to bargain with him, she tried to scold him, and finally she called her mother, the boy's mother, and said to her, "I'm at the point of no return with your son. He's completely out of control," she said. To which the mother replied, "What's the problem?" And she said, "The problem is twofold. Number one, your son's behavior is horrific." And then she paused and she said, "Number two, he has a perfect attendance record." You know, my friends, that's what St. John the Baptist is trying to tell each one of us today as we prepare for Christmas. Trying to correct our behavior, right? Trying to correct our behavior. And in the gospel today, he says words that they would have been very, very familiar with. He said, "Make straight the path. Make straight the path." He said, "Prepare the way." That phrase, my friends, was used in the Babylonian and Roman empires. There was actually soldiers called sappers. And they worked for the emperor, the king, and they would go out before the king would ever leave to go to his destination, and they would make sure that the road was properly cleared. They would get all the obstacles out of the way. They would fill in all the ditches or the holes so the chariots would be able to travel very safely and smoothly. Prepare the road. So when he was saying prepare, the people understood what that meant. Prepare our hearts so there's an easy entry for our Savior to come into our hearts. What's the biggest obstacle, my friends? It's the sins in our lives, right? That is the biggest obstacle to Christmas and the Savior taking effect in each one of us. I read an interesting article by a pastor that bought a house in Florida. It was on the lakefront property. And it was on the market for well over a year and unoccupied for a year. So it needed some repair. But the dock in the back that was against the lake, there was this big bush that had grown up and you couldn't even get on the dock. It was so massive. And it was really actually destroyed the dock itself. So one of the first things that the family did when they moved in there was cut this bush back. Well, it wasn't very long before the bush kept growing, so they cut it back down to the roots. And they even tried to remove the roots, but because the roots were so penetrating and so large, they couldn't do it. But they realized that every now and then, every month and a half or so, they would have to take an axe to the roots, because the roots would actually things would start sprouting up. And before it would get too much, they needed to level it. But I thought to myself, you know, people say all the time to me, "Father, I'm always confessing the same sins over and over again." And I say, yeah, that's right. Because we all have root sins. My root sin or sins is different than your root sins. We all have particular sins that are unique to us. And you know, my friends, those are called root sins. But if we let them go, what happens? They grow. They grow. So even though we seem like we're repeating the same sins over and over again when we go to confession, we're actually trimming them back, so they're not taking control of our lives. This Sunday afternoon we have a penance service, and normally we have it scheduled for next week, but because of St. Joan of Arc has theirs on Sunday night, it would be too much for us priests to do this afternoon and evening, so I moved it ahead a week. And because of that, my friends, I added a couple other days too. So I added Thursdays, the next 2 Thursdays, and the Monday before Christmas. The Thursdays are from 4:30 to 6. And I will not only be hearing confession, but the Blessed Sacrament will be exposed. If you would like to come in and pray for a short time, my friends, it's such a hectic time. It's good to come into the church, get some peace, and then go back. And then I'll be hearing confessions as well. And then on Monday, the 23rd, from 5 to 7 as well. I read an interesting article this past week. It was written by a young man called Eric. He was in his mid-40s. When he was a young boy, he left the church, he and his parents, and then he got married and had 2 small children. And one of them it was this time of year, one of them was going to have his first communion in the spring, and he thought to himself, he's got to get back to doing this church. And he said he knew deep down that he was going to have to go to confession, but he didn't want to. This is what he said. I was nervous, frightened, and embarrassed. I had to say out loud all the mean, disgusting, perverted, hurtful, and immoral things that I had done. And it wasn't easy. When I went to the sacrament, the priest was elderly, did not say too much. He greeted with me with a smile. And then after my sins, he said, as I struggled through my sins, I felt filthier than dung. But the priest simply smiled